Hello and welcome to another edition of Pulse. My name is Anthony Patch. Today is Sunday, August 17th, 2025. The title of my brief presentation is All Roads Lead to Moscow. Of course, we're talking about the peace negotiations between President Trump and Vladimir Putin that took place in Alaska, and unfortunately, there are a number of people that are characterizing this as a nothing burger. My message today is to counter that notion that this was a nothing burger, that it was, maybe to put it differently, much ado about nothing. Now, there were no significant announcements, but that's not the point. And I'd like to illustrate some of those points that are taking place behind the scenes. One programming note: I want to apologize for the long gap since our last Pulse recording or presentation. My wife and I have relocated. We sold our previous home here in New Hampshire, and we're still in New Hampshire. We just have moved further north. But with that said, we plan to continue these Pulse presentations on a more regular basis, focusing on geopolitics. But I'd also like to invite you to my website at anthonypatch.com, where you will be able to learn about our live streams that we present 3 times a week, 2 hours, an hour and a half to 2 hours, 3 times a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings. There are about 1,000 live streams in the archives that you would have access to if you choose to join as a subscriber, and information can be found at anthonypatch.com. We also publish a monthly magazine entitled Entangled, which you would also have access to all of the previous issues of that. We will be publishing a magazine again this month, before the end of the month, and endeavor to get caught up. Nonetheless, things have been a little bit chaotic here in the Patch household, but it's settling in, and we're getting things organized and refocused on presenting information to you. So today, and again, this will be fairly brief, but what this is really leading to, and I typically like to give the punchline right up front and then backfill. The punchline is there will be a peace agreement, not a ceasefire. Now, normally that's where most of the presenters that you've been paying attention to in the last couple of days since the end of this meeting, this summit as it was characterized in Alaska, that's not the stopping point. It's not so much a question of, although it is, but it's not so much a question of will there be a ceasefire agreement or will there be a peace agreement. It's much bigger than that. And again, we endeavor here in discussing geopolitics to look at this from a truly big picture perspective. And that big picture that I'm going to lead you to at the end of this short presentation is back to BRICS. And I'll show you how we get there. I chose the title All Roads Lead to Moscow because ultimately they lead to BRICS. But all roads lead to Moscow geopolitically, certainly militarily, certainly politically, all of these factors, and economically. What I'd like to share with you is that there can only be a peace agreement and not a ceasefire. The reason for the lack of a ceasefire is this would, from a military standpoint, provide Ukraine and the Western forces supporting Ukraine the opportunity to rearm and reposition military forces in Ukraine. And of course, Vladimir Putin, Russia in particular, is in a position where they seriously do not need to negotiate. They are in the power position. So why would they, strategically speaking, allow for the enemy to rearm itself? That doesn't make any sense. Again, to keep this brief, I want to go beyond just the issue of ceasefire and peace agreement and list for you the three primary issues from the Russian perspective of what they need to have in place in order to sign a peace agreement. They are not going to allow any sort of ceasefire. When I say ceasefire, I mean across the spectrum in Ukraine, air, ground, and sea. They're not going to allow for a ceasefire and a rearmament, because that's just going to strengthen the opposition and prolong the special military operation. So the three primary things that Putin, again, re-emphasized to President Trump in Alaska. Number one, the four oblasts or oblasts. These are regions. You can think of them as counties here in the United States or in Britain, counties within Ukraine. But these are large regions that militarily the Russians have already occupied and now consider them, from a legal standpoint, to be annexed territory of Russia. And these are areas that are predominantly populated by ethnic Russians. And therefore, this, along with Crimea, Russia is steadfast in saying these belong to Russia. That is non-negotiable. Number two, that Ukraine itself, from a political as well as military standpoint, must be neutral. In other words, it cannot be allowed to join NATO, nor for NATO to recognize under Article 5 the mutual defense of Ukraine by Western forces, which is essentially the situation that has existed now for almost 4 years. That there can be no NATO membership, no Western security forces, weapons or so-called boots on the ground troops providing security to Ukraine. Ukraine must stand on its own. Europe, the United States, etc., cannot stipulate to Russia as part of a peace agreement that they will ensure the security on behalf of Ukraine. Russia will not allow to that. Number three, Ukraine, its military must disarm, not entirely, but down to a level in which Ukraine's military poses no offensive threat to Russia or any other country. This would be Poland, Belarus, etc. Russia is recognizing that a sovereign country has the right to defend itself, and that includes Ukraine. But this must be a much smaller. Figures over the last couple of years have been presented of 80 to 85,000 troops, something on that order. Okay? So again, no membership in NATO. They must be neutral, smaller military. And one thing that often is not included in this discussion of neutrality and military strength is the denazification of Ukraine. And in the latest meeting between Trump and Putin, this did not come up. So it's not getting very much attention, but it would in any subsequent or forthcoming peace negotiations for a peace treaty. The denazification, that means that those that are in political power or in economic power or both that are ultra right wing must be removed from power, whatever that mechanism, however that manifests. they need to be dissolved of any influence, any power within the country in order to satisfy the requirements. And that's the fourth, but somewhat diminished demand on the part of Russia. This must be accomplished before a peace treaty can be signed, before it can be ratified. So far, we've been talking about Putin and Trump. What about Zelensky? Well, Monday afternoon, Washington, D.C. time, there is a meeting scheduled between President Trump and Zelensky. It's my personal opinion, and of course, that's what most of this Pulse video is my personal opinion, is that Trump will tell Zelensky, here's what Russia demands. 1, 2, 3, and 4, including the territory, the obelisks, Crimea. In other words, don't even go there. They belong to Russia. You've lost it. The consequence of not entering into legitimate peace negotiations, which is really one-sided because Russia holds all the cards. But failure to do that means that Russia will continue its special military operation. Putin has made it very clear over the last 4 years, even from a military standpoint, they do not want to occupy all of Ukraine. They don't want the headache. They don't want the economic impact. They want to take care of the regions where their ethnic Russian brethren reside and have been residing. And that's it. So Zelensky will be told that Russia may conquer by force of arms to secure what Russia needs for its own security. And that's what this whole thing has been about. The United States, under the Obama administration, stated unequivocally to Russia that the U.S., that NATO itself, would not move into, provide arms to, thus providing a threat, representing a threat to Russia, would not move into Ukraine, would not border with NATO forces, including missiles, would not place those arms on the border of Russia. Clearly, the West violated that agreement. This would be akin here in the United States to Russia occupying Canada or Mexico, or both. The United States certainly would not tolerate that. Why should the Russians tolerate Western forces on the Russian border? And certainly when we consider the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, on that border, in that border territory, that have been heavily persecuted by the ethnic Ukrainians. So these things need to be kept in mind, but we need to bear in mind, and I use that word bear specifically, we need to bear in mind that what we're talking about from a big picture perspective here are two major superpowers. The United States holds more nuclear weapons than Russia. Now, you could get into discussion of delivery platforms and deployment and that sort of thing, readiness, so to speak. But really, if we just look at the raw numbers, the United States does have a larger quantity of nuclear warheads. But that's not the issue. There are more than enough on both sides, and we could include China in this discussion, but for right now, we'll focus on Russia and the United States. They don't need to use, nor would they have time and ability to use all of those weapons. So it's really irrelevant when you talk about the quantities of nuclear weapons. But it is relevant to bear in mind that what we're talking about here are two major superpowers, neither of which desires to be at war with one another. Trump has said, even during his campaign, that his goal was peace. We'll take him at his word. I think he has found it has been more problematic to achieve that peace than he really understood until he came into office. But nonetheless, he still wants peace. That's what he tells the world. Same thing with Vladimir Putin. So what about Zelensky meeting with the President of the United States on Monday? Last time in February, that did not go well in the Oval Office. Trump told Zelensky at the time that you don't have any cards to play. You will do what you're told. I think the ultimate threat, and I think this is what was reinforced in Alaska, was Putin made it very clear, diplomatically, made it very clear to President Trump, you don't have any cards to play. You need to cease supporting in any manner Ukraine. Now, I think humanitarian aid would be allowed, but the support that we have been providing will be cut off. And I think that message of you don't have any cards to play, delivered this time by Trump to Zelensky, meaning we will just simply cut off support of your military operations unless you agree to enter into bona fide peace negotiations mediated by the United States, but negotiations directly between Ukraine and Russia. Now, you can well appreciate Zelensky not having any cards, in other words, having no points to negotiate from, is simply going to walk into a meeting with Putin, and I'm sure Trump will be in attendance, but more on the sideline. Zelensky will have been given his marching orders by Trump. Zelensky will follow through on those orders and simply listen to the terms delivered by Putin, nod in agreement, and sign on the dotted line. Zelensky knows the 4 points, including the denazification that I outlined to you, understands the territorial issues, understands neutrality and no membership in NATO, and understands the disarmament of their own military, what's left of it. It's been decimated in this war. So what's the truly big picture we're leading to? Well, again, it's BRICS, and we're getting there. There has been some discussion about a partial ceasefire, and this would be restricted to the airspace. That would include drones, missiles, aircraft. There would be a ceasefire in the air. And I think this is something that Putin has granted Trump as a face-saving maneuver, as a gesture, to give Trump something, because Trump, really all he has said since the conclusion of this meeting was that it was a 10 out of 10, that he was very pleased. I think what Vladimir Putin did was say what we might agree to a ceasefire in the air, understanding that really, aside from the drones that Ukraine launches, and they're very ineffective, they're pinpricks, they're really irrelevant to the Russians, because Russia controls the airspace. If you're talking about military aircraft, if you're talking about missiles, including the hypersonic missiles, one of which is the Oreshnik, Russia controls the airspace. So agreeing to a ceasefire in the air really does not have much impact other than a political feather in the cap of President Trump. And I think that will be granted. We'll hear more about that, I'm sure, on Monday. But again, Zelensky is not in a position to say anything. He is only in a position to come to the White House, sit down in the Oval Office, and listen. If he does anything other than just listen and then agree, there could be severe consequences to him personally. And I won't go there. I'll just leave it at that. The discussion of a peace agreement concluding the meeting in Alaska, the last statement that Putin made to Trump, at least in front of the cameras, was perhaps there will be a meeting in Moscow. And Trump agreed to that. He nodded in agreement to that. That may happen within the next 2 weeks. So this could be a very rapidly unfolding chain of events, beginning with the meeting tomorrow. Perhaps the meeting between the President of the United States and Vladimir Zelensky may prove to be a more significant meeting in terms of outcomes, results, than the meeting between Putin and Trump. Putin and Trump just kind of got the ball rolling. Trump really was coming in with no cards to play, coming in just to listen. You see the pattern. You see how the trickle-down effect is occurring here. This is from Putin to Trump to Zelensky. That's how it's playing out. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, and I'm sure we'll do more pulse reporting here, as well as in our live streams, we'll do more analysis from a biblical perspective. We'll do more analysis on our live streams of what is unfolding. So this brings me to BRICS, to our concluding thoughts. In my last two pulses, which are now a couple of months old, I was talking about what I believe is the inescapable, and I look at this purely from a logic standpoint, not a position of being dogmatic in order to somehow prove myself to be correct in my analysis. That's not even relevant to my thought process or to the discussion. What I'm offering to you is that from a logical, analytical, critical thinking perspective, it is inevitable from a global perspective, inevitable for all of the countries of the world to join together economically. That's the starting point. That's the basis for BRICS, economics. As I outlined in my previous pulses, what the U.S. is doing by way of sanctions and tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, is isolating economically, politically, even militarily, isolating the United States from the rest of the world, including Europe, our closest allies, and especially with our absolutely closest ally, Japan. And I say absolutely because of economic reasons. We're imposing 15% tariffs on Japan, while Japan has committed over $500 billion in domestic, meaning United States, investment. Again, that is not logical. At any rate, the isolation that the U.S. is already experiencing, and it is exacerbating, I think is all part of problem, reaction, solution. When people, business people, corporate, political, on the federal level and at the domestic local levels in the United States and people so-called do the math, they realize that we're being isolated. And they realize what I've pointed out in our live streams, that tariffs are paid for by the consumers, not the corporations, not the state, not the government. These are taxes. These are consumer taxes because the consumer ultimately pays the tariffs. So people are beginning to do the math and understand this. And that's not just in the United States, but on the part of the United States, this awakening to the tariffs and the isolation that is occurring and the cost, the economic cost to the people of the United States. The people of the United States are pushing back. That's the reaction and problem, reaction, solution. The solution that will be offered, because this is a purposeful setup. Ukraine, set aside the military conflict, Ukraine has been all about economic unification of the world. That's truly big picture. Economic unification of the world. You have to bring the world to its knees through deficits, through debt. That's the reaction that people are reacting to, is the debt, and they demand a solution. What has been presented now for a few years is BRICS, and is about to explode into the United States. Very few people in the United States even know what BRICS is. The president certainly discounts BRICS, disavows BRICS, looks at that as a threat. That's all to produce a reaction in people, which is something that Trump is very adept at doing, producing reactions. So here comes the solution. Trump says, we're going to bring peace to Ukraine. We're going to do that through economics. We are going to produce what has been very sporadically presented in the mainstream media, and that is a reset. Now, most people think, including me as I've presented on the reset for 4 years now, that this is an economic reset. It is and it isn't. It isn't by looking at the starting point, the impetus for a reset. This reset is diplomatic. The diplomacy between the US government and the Russian government is being reset as I speak. That's what this meeting in Alaska was really all about. It was about the two leaders agreeing that at that point in time, they're moving forward together, not in opposition, but together to reset the diplomatic relations between the two countries. That's the starting point. This then leads to the reset of economic relations. Remember, Trump is all about making the deal. Well, to a large degree, so is Putin. That's reflected in BRICS. BRICS is not a military security organization. That underlies, that underpins the relationships, but the primary purpose and relationship between the members of BRICS and those that are seeking membership in BRICS is for economic reasons, trade, for prosperity, for profit. So what Putin is illustrating to Trump, and Trump, he does understand this, despite all the disparaging so-called analysis of Trump. And, you know, I've been there too. I've been a critic of him as well. But if we look at it from the big picture, Trump understands that this is all about business. Therefore, he is going to say, look, peace and safety, peace and security. We are going to bring about a peace agreement with respect to Ukraine that really is an economic agreement, a resetting of diplomacy, a resetting of economic relations, of trade relations between the United States and Russia. This addresses the reaction by people in the United States that are doing the math and are understanding that we are being isolated. This addresses the isolation issue, or the issue of isolation. Trump has said that he wants to be nominated and wants to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He is going to say peace and safety. This is scriptural. He's going to say peace and safety, peace and security through trade, through resetting our diplomatic and economic and certainly military relationship with Russia, because these are two nuclear superpowers. Now, the converse to this, when we talk about superpowers, what is the alternative to the reset? It's war and further war, an expansion of war. We've been on the precipice of tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine and against Europe itself. That still exists today. The Europeans, the leaders, not the people, but the European leaders, continue today to push supporting Ukraine and pushing the destruction of Russia. This is the tactical nuclear level of conflict that Europe is pushing for. Well, you don't just go with limited tactical nukes. That goes to strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States by way of Russia and China and North Korea and Pakistan. So that's the converse to the reset, to the peace and safety. I think if I can imagine the mindset, the thinking of Putin, he doesn't care if Trump is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, that he's somehow given credit. He knows the ego of Trump. And he's going to say, fine, you want the Peace Prize, you want the awards, you want the accolades, take it. I don't care. It's irrelevant to what I want to achieve. I want security for Russia. Then I want trade and prosperity for Russia. That's the thinking of Putin. So all roads lead to Moscow. That's BRICS. Yes, there are other member nations, but bear in mind, if it were not for Moscow, there would be no BRICS. So I'll finish with this. I will repeat the scenario that I've repeated in my last two Pulse presentations. Trump knows that behind the scenes for over 4 years, the central banks of Russia, all BRICS members, and the United States Central Bank, which is the Federal Reserve, have successfully been testing simulated cross-border trade using their respective sovereign central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. This, yes, circumvents the clearinghouse known as SWIFT. This brings all of the settlement of transactions under the umbrella of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. And all of this cryptocurrency activity occurs within the banking system of the BIS and will then be the principal focus for the president when he announces. Ukraine will be number two. The number one point that Trump will cite is that the United States is now a member of BRICS and, in fact, has been for over 4 years a member of BRICS. And then he will quickly explain that we've been a member because we've been testing our CBDC with BRICS member nations through the BIS. Number 2 will be Ukraine. We are bringing about peace and safety for Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the world through this peace treaty by way of a diplomatic and economic reset occurring between the U.S. and Russia, which will then include a reset diplomatically and economically for Ukraine. Now, you'll notice in what I've been presenting, I've not been including the European leaders, other than to say they're trying to lead the world into a nuclear exchange. I've excluded them because they will be excluded in this peace treaty, in this economic reset. They will be the third announcement by Trump, and that will be Europe, unless you want to be isolated, unless you want to go bankrupt, you need to be part of this economic reset with Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine. You need to lay down your arms and join BRICS. Now, if you are a reader of biblical scripture, this ultimately leads to a one world government, a one world leader, and we elaborate on that quite a bit in our live streams. And I would ask you, if you would like to hear more about that, to subscribe. The issue here is we are not on the verge of war. Yes, we have Ukraine. It is a war. The Russians want to call it a special military operation. That's fine. But the issue here is that in the very near term, the world is not leading to a global thermonuclear war. That's the good news. In the very near term, it is leading to peace and safety by way of this peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine and the Western forces. But that's only temporary. That's why I said it is very short term. What you need to bear in mind is that we are on the fast track to a one world government and a one world leader. So when people speak of the so-called global elite, okay, these are certainly presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, but these are the bankers. The bankers dictate policy to governments. They control the money. The central banks, that's what I'm speaking predominantly about. But also the corporate leaders, especially in the technology sector. But it's really the banking environment that drives the social, the economic, and the military agendas of our world. So ultimately, we will see peace and safety that leads to, and I'm speaking from scripture, that leads to sudden destruction. I need to mention that because I'm not going to paint just a rosy picture here. We need to understand the ways of the world, the direction that it is headed. But at least in the near term, I think we can expect a limited degree of peace and safety by way of a peace treaty and a reset diplomatically and economically and militarily between the U.S. and Russia. Two superpowers that up until this meeting in Alaska were on the brink of a nuclear exchange. The world has stepped back from the precipice, at least for now. thank you for listening, and we will endeavor to keep you apprised of these global events, geopolitical events, more frequently as we move forward, especially over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. Thank you, and God bless.